Since 1881, Leicester Secular Hall has been home to the world's oldest secularist society. For over 130 years, the hall has stood as a forum for free thought, radical politics and controversial ideas. But by the turn of the 20th century, the rational values of the society would be challenged by the extreme ideologies of imperialism and fascism during the most bloody wars in human history. Some members would fight and die for their beliefs. Others would make their stand of pacifism. Whether in the name of socialism, libertarianism or God, the wars would test every man's conscience. The hall took on a vital significance in the city, a centre not only of learning and debate, but of fraternity and leisure, an open forum for the people of Leicester in the moral crises of wartime. Leicester itself had long had a history of radical politics. Its industrial traditions of hosiery, boot and shoe and light engineering had made Leicester a proud city of working class values and popular political dissent. The hall had quickly become a vital centre for the city's significant base of alternative opinion and ideology.
Well, the Secular Hall was available for bookings for any group that wanted to book it, and very often it enabled free speech to take place because people who couldn't book other places could book the Secular Hall, and that's in fact how the Secular Hall had come to be built, because the secularists had tried to book the Temperance Hall and they got turned down, and they thought, well, we'll have to build a hall of our own. And so it's always been a sort of a bastion for free speech. There was a tradition of radicalism going right the way back to the 18th century in Leicester, and of course you also had the growth of trade unions and the early growth of the cooperative movement in Leicester as well. Basically, the boot and shoe workers and the hosiery workers, which eventually became a national union, were based here because those two industries were based in Leicester, but of course those industries have all but disappeared.
At the turn of the century, Britain had declared war in South Africa. The Second Boer War marked the apex of 19th century British propaganda and would transform the way war would be reported, promoted and perceived in the 20th century. The large majority of Britain's newspapers were actively in favour of the war, and popular public support and appetite for the war was correlatively high. 300 reporters would be assigned to the front line, while the advent of new telegraph technology meant reports could be printed the following day. Cinemas showing propaganda films and battle recreations saw a significant boom. Criticism of the war was squeezed to the margins. Upon the relief of Ladysmith and Mafeking by Leicestershire troops in 1900, the Leicester Mercury reports of the levels of patriotic celebration that swept the city and county.
The tidings for which the nation has prayed for weeks have arrived at last. Ladysmith is relieved. In no part of the empire will the news be received with greater joy than in Leicester. Close upon 1,000 men from Leicestershire have been in the beleaguered valley. There is a feeling of relief in many a Leicester home today. On all of the public buildings the Union Jack was also raised. The streets quickly assumed a gay appearance, and the demeanour of the public was that of unalloyed gratification. Merry peals from the church bells rang the tidings over the countryside.
When troops from the Yeomanry and the voluntary battalion of the Leicestershire Regiment left for the cause, Granby Street would be lined with thousands of supporters.
The march back to the station was no easy one. The streets had been packed with thousands of people who cheered continuously. The main street was ablaze with coloured lights, rockets and other fireworks, and the scene can be better imagined than described.
A letter to the Leicester Mercury from Mary Roddy of Wigston's Girls' School illustrates the popular feelings of the time.
One must remember that there is much to be thankful for in the preservation of the loyalty of the natives. Britain has ever regarded her subjects, of whatever colour, or however ignorant and degraded, with justice and freedom. But above it all are assurances to those that sit at home that the British grit and pluck are still the same old grit that won and held the empire. The word beaten is not in the British soldiers' vocabulary. For the British to stop when the enemy are spreading over British territory in every direction, never. Rather would the women of England take up arms.
However, the real atrocities of the war and its devastating effect on the Boer people were a far cry from the patriotic reports making their way home. During the war, two figures stood prominent in Leicester Secular Society: President Sidney Jimson and Secretary Frederick Gould.
Gould was engaged as the full-time worker. He was a very sort of go-ahead and quite dynamic individual. had his own particular views on things. For instance, he believed in temperance, and he eventually persuaded the Secular Society to close its bar, which was the only place in Leicester you could buy a drink on a Sunday, and that was on the ground floor of this building, where you could go and have a drink and play snooker. Well, he argued this interfered with having the meeting.
He ran the Sunday school, he set up the Ethical Guild, which was for older teenagers. He did a lot. His views differed, I think, from Jimson and a lot of the society, and I think relations became a bit tense.
Sidney Jimson really assumed presidency of the Secular Society really on his father's death in the, was it 1883, somewhere about then, and he remained a sort of stalwart of the society really until his death.
He was a wonderful president, and the society I would doubt whether it would be here if it hadn't been for him. He made it a place for anybody, really, in the way he treated the ordinary membership. His financial support was invaluable. He established a lecture programme and kept it going. It was an amazing lecture programme, really, with eminent speakers from all over coming to speak in Leicester. They were all contacts of Sidney Jimson's.
Without a popular media outlet for criticism of the war, and in the name of free thought, the Society would play host to speakers who had returned from the South African front with a story very different to the jingoism prevalent in the daily papers. Two key figures would be J.M. Robertson and the soon-to-be South African heroine, Emily Hobhouse.
She was an example of what happens to women who stick their heads above the parapet. She brought to the attention of the British public the reality of war and what was happening in South Africa. And the government were absolutely vicious about her, and the right-wing press were ditto. She just seems to have been written out of the history books in England. You know, she's virtually a saint in South Africa.
Hobhouse had witnessed firsthand the horrors of the concentration camps, the disease, malnutrition and cruelty of the British forces, particularly amongst women and children, fuelled her anger that the truth must out. And in 1901, that was exactly what she intended to do at Leicester Secular Hall.
It's such a curious position, hollow and rotten to the heart's core, to have made all over the state large uncomfortable communities of people whom you call refugees and say you're protecting, but who call themselves prisoners of war. The rations were extremely meagre, and when, as I frequently experienced, the actual quantity dispensed fell short of the amount prescribed, it simply meant famine. I saw crowds of them along the railway lines in bitterly cold weather, in pouring rain, hungry, sick, dying and dead. Above all, one would hope that the good sense, if not the mercy, of the English people will cry out against the further development of this cruel system, which falls with crushing effect upon the old, the weak and the children.
The local establishment were perturbed. Controversial opinions, incendiary language and criticism of British foreign policy would be a plain recipe for social unrest. In his memoirs, Society President Sidney Jimson recalls the night in question.
While the Boer War was on, we had several meetings of protest in our hall. At one meeting, Emily Hobhouse was to speak. A police official came to see me beforehand and suggested that the meeting might possibly lead to disorder and asked if we would give it up. I said we should certainly not give it up unless they definitely forbade it. He said if we determined to hold it, they would do their best to protect us. So far, this was satisfactory. 1 or 2 constables would be in the audience, and then if there was any disturbance, they would send out word, and in 2 minutes, 40 constables, who would be unnoticeably stationed all around about, could be in the hall to check any trouble. I thought the arrangement was reasonable, though unnecessary. Eventually, the meeting was held with a good and perfectly orderly audience.
The impact of the speeches on those who packed into the hall was immeasurable. The Leicester Peace Society recorded that demand for her leaflets on the concentration camps would prove insufficient to meet the demand. Robertson's lectures were equally critical, controversial and moving.
Many persons were turned away from the doors of the Leicester Secular Hall last Sunday evening, on the occasion of Mr. J. M. Robertson's lecture, What is Happening in South Africa. The main propositions of the lecture were that the war in South Africa had been from the first of a racial character, and that the effect had been to alienate the great mass of our Dutch fellow citizens. That being of this racial character, the war was being carried on in a ruinous and barbarous manner, and would lead to the overthrow of British rule in South Africa. If Britain refused to grant independence, the Dutch would ultimately rise, and might, after all, drive the English into the sea.
The inclusion of Robertson's photography projected with lantern slides couldn't help but horrify and appall an audience who could never have imagined images of such human suffering.
That lecture was a shock to us. I have never forgotten the lesson it taught me of the essential barbarity and cruelty of war. It seemed incredible that our soldiers, people like you and me, could be responsible for such horrors.
The imperialist goals of the war and its brutal conduct would force the society itself into action. In July 1901, Jimson and Gould would be among a delegation from the society to attempt to devise a means of opposing conscription to South Africa. By May 1902, the war was over. Britain had won, but the brutality and barbarism of such a fierce imperialist war had left significant doubts and scars. Rudyard Kipling wrote, "Let us admit it fairly, as a business people should. We've had no end of a lesson. It will do us no end of good." But just how far would those imperialist lessons go? 1914. Britain is mobilising into action for the war to end all wars, but Leicester, ever the dissident city, seemed distinctly unconvinced.
Well, conscription was introduced in, I think, 1915, and up till then, Leicester had the worst volunteering rate out of any town in England, maybe Wales and Scotland as well, I don't know, but certainly there was a motion down in the council decrying this fact. And that was probably down to the influence of the Independent Labour Party, which was very much opposed to the war. But I think there was a sort of a division within the secular society between those who were opposed to the war and those who were in favour of it. But nevertheless, the various anti-war bodies did meet here, and you know, when they couldn't obtain other places, because opposing the First World War was a deeply unpopular thing to do, and the secular society did enable the meetings to take place here.
In the face of such dramatic world-changing events, and in accordance with its ideals, it is perhaps no surprise that the society was divided. Gone was the campaign against conscriptions begun during the Boer War, and the society even allowed the display of army recruitment advertisements. The society instead focused on fundraisers and benefit concerts for wounded soldiers. The hall would hold evenings of entertainment for them, and in April 1917 it was resolved that the doors to the hall would remain open to any soldier or sailor visiting Leicester wherever possible. Many members and friends of the society itself had been called up, and reports were frequently returned to the hall of the dead and wounded. Among those members called up and lucky enough to survive was Herbert Arnsby Orton.
I worked at Freeman, Hardy and Willis, you know, they're a very famous old firm, and Sir Jonathan North, the school's named after him, he got all the youngsters that were there, and I was one of them. "Now, my lads, you will join the forces. England wants you." Kitchener's finger pointing at you. You know, it's you we want. So of course, we all went. I was sent down to Southampton. Senior officer of the Navy was there, a senior naval officer, and I was put aboard a ship with 6 more, and we kept together nearly the whole of the war. We were hospital ships in the first place until they began to sink them, and then they made us a transport, a hospital ambulance transport, and they put a gun on the back of us, 6-inch gun on the back, and we used to go all over the world. I went from everywhere in the world, of seats of war, from Mesopotamia up the Persian Gulf to Basra, and up round there, or India, Bombay.
It was mixed for young men of that time. You know, they were brought up in very poor conditions in a back street in Leicester, and then they suddenly got the opportunity to go to the West Indies, to Turkey, to Egypt, to America. So that was interesting and exciting, but the war wasn't. And it was in the medical course, so he was dealing with real horrors, especially at Gallipoli, I think.
In a poem written at the time, Bert recorded the toil and slog of his time stoking the engines in the belly of his hospital ship upon the Indian Ocean.
I know I'm not much to look at, and maybe I'm down at heel. My face ain't as smooth as God made it, and I eats with my knife at a meal. You see, I belong down below deck. I'm only allowed in the well, and heaven's saloon deck and stewards, whilst I'm in a clanking hell. The second he looks at the steam gauge, and his language is bloody blue if he finds the pressure ain't rising above the mark 72. My fire's like a boozer's gizzard. It's always asking for more, and I cuss and I sweat as I feed it, a wishing that I was on shore. It's not so bad when she's steady and she's running to time on the trip, but if she's behind and it's blowing, it's enough to give you the pip. When 8 bells is sounded up forward and you're thinking of turning in, they tell you the watch is doubled. 8 hours in that stinking din. When your singlet is black and oozing and the sweat runs down to your boots, and you burn yourself on the fire door as over a roller she shoots. When you come to the end of the voyage and your payoff is 20 quid, well, I reckon you've blooming well earned it, if any bloke did.
For Society member Jack Abbott, however, service and the human atrocities of war proved too much.
He was a very good-looking gentleman, Jack Abbott. He had a boot and shoe factory, small one. But because he had socialist views on being fair and paying fair wages, it collapsed. Yeah, a very sensitive man, I would say. Yes, yeah, too sensitive to live a happy life.
He went to war. Like many of the secularists, they had no intention of killing anybody. They were against the war, but they felt they hadn't got any choice, because if they went to prison, they were leaving their families destitute. He couldn't cope with it, couldn't stand it. I don't know where he was or what his experiences were, but when he came home on leave, he wouldn't go back.
While on leave from the front, Jack deserted. The penalty was the firing squad. Desperately, Jack and his wife Grace fled Leicester to London. Grace would have to take work to support them, sheltering Jack in the attic until the war's end.
She got work doing dressmaking. Very brave woman, really. If I was a novelist, I would like to write about that, but I'm not. It must have been horrendous. I don't know how she did it.
Jack would not reappear at Leicester Secular Society until the mid-20s, when after years in hiding, the amnesty for deserters would be declared. For other Leicester secularists, service in an imperial war had always seemed the utmost moral aberration. Members such as Edgar Eagle and Charlie Hassell would oppose the war from the onset. Consequently, Eagle, whose father Charles had originally helped coin the term conscientious objector with the Anti-Vaccination League, would be branded one himself. Both he and Charlie Hassell would see prison time for their stance.
Yes, Charles Alonso. I admired him. He was a conscientious objector, of course, you know. And he was a very good man. He must have been in some sort of cell. And he told us about tying a pudding on a string and what they didn't want, they tied on the end of this and sent it along to the next bloke. That's all I can remember him telling me.
Oh, they got labelled as conscientious, which was a term of, which was an insult.
Well, they were also labelled as cowards.
Yes.
And there was all that
white feathers and
the patriotism stuff. The pressure, the social pressure was huge. So incredibly brave.
Jimson and Gould, however, had taken a very different position. Too old to serve, the two men who had been so vehemently involved in the peace movement during the Boer War would now find themselves speaking out in favour of the conflict. But the impact of war would ultimately affect both men's resolve very differently. As president, Jimson tried to keep the society on a path of neutrality, though he had his own interests and beliefs in the war.
Jimson did become involved with the housing of Belgian refugees in Leicester, and I think actually probably took some in himself. And you know, the Belgian refugee argument was used as an argument by the establishment of why there should be a First World War, because the Germans were raping and pillaging Belgium, whereas at the outbreak of the First World War, the socialists in the ILP had argued that the government was making allegiance with an autocracy, the Tsar, to attack another progressive democratic country, i.e. Germany. And this was the kind of argument. So to circumvent this kind of argument, this establishment very much played up the issue of Belgian atrocities, and Jimson became involved with that. And of course, as an engineering firm which he was involved with, the Jimson factory, obviously it had a vested interest in making things for the war, as did a lot of the Leicester industries, which of course you would think making boots in Leicester. There was a big order for boots during the First World War, and of course it resulted in a lot of very prosperous factories and factory owners. Clearly Jimson's firm was busy making, I think they made tanks actually, or bits for tanks, so he had a vested interest.
As chair of Leicester's Refugee Council, the plight of Belgian refugees in the city was an issue very close to his heart. By December of 1914 alone, Leicester had already offered refuge to over 400 Belgians fleeing the Kaiser's invasion. The Secular Society would help Jimson's cause through charitable fundraisers and concerts, and efforts were afforded by the Society to ensure a guest house to accommodate 5 or 6 of the refugees. By the end of the war, Jimson had helped to house over 900 Belgian refugees in Leicester. On the relief of their country, a farewell party was thrown in Leicester for those returning. At the event, Jimson is reported to have announced,
"I had been known as the father of the Belgians. 900 was a large family, but I tried to do the best possible. They had grown to understand each other. Many friendships had been made, little ones had been born, and they had united in sorrows as well as in joys. I congratulate them on the freeing of their land, and wish peace, happiness and prosperity to their heroic nation."
But the war did not pass the Jimsons by without misfortune. In February 1915, word reached the family home that Sidney's son Humphrey had been seriously wounded in France. Sidney and his wife immediately set off to join their son. However, a letter received by the Society from Sidney continued to display his unshakable belief in the important work of the Society. Only the path of free thought and rationalism, he insisted, would ultimately end war.
"I do not think that at any time our work, indeed our very existence, was more important than today. In time of war there is always danger of reaction, and with due regard to the safety of the realm, but no yielding to irrational panic, we must keep a watchful guard over our great heritage of free speech. Also, I hope that when the war is over, we shall be among those who work for such arrangements, both here and abroad, as shall prevent us from getting into the grip of militarism and shall bring nearer to us a real world peace."
However, for Gould, the tragedy of war would mark a major turning point in his own philosophy. By the outbreak of the First World War, Frederick Gould was now living in Lincoln.
Gould, of course, was very much in favour of a thing called positivism, which believed in all the trappings of a church, but with no God. And he eventually left the secular employment of the Secular Society, where he acted as a sort of pastor almost, to form a positivist church where he could engage in sort of rituals without a God.
He was against the First World War, but far as I can understand, his son was keen to join up and argued persuasively with his father, and his father's views wavered.
The news that his beloved son Julian had himself enlisted to the army had a dramatic effect on his own perception of the war, of conscription, and of the peace movement. Julian was cherished by his father. A staunch socialist and gifted artist, Frederick's dream was that his son might one day paint what he described as the great vision of emancipated labour. Julian's battalion left for France in November 1915. He would fight and survive the Battle of the Somme in 1916, but in 1917, at Monchy-le-Preux, near Arras, Julian was killed in action, aged 25. Gould would write this poem to his memory.
At Monchy-le-Preux, near Arras, where fell a young soldier, 31st of May, 1917, whose grave is unknown, and who is a symbol of 10 million dead. Amid drear ruined fields and blasted meads, near where yon shattered village crowns the hill, perhaps your hasty grave lies here, where still the old trench lines are marked with stones and weeds. We come with tears of bitter penitence. Upon this spot, dear youth, we lay our pride, our pomp, our learned show, and fain would hide the record of boasts and poor pretence. We churches, temples, synagogues and creeds, we senates, councils, parliaments and laws, we colleges, whose lofty science draws the studious crowd, we are but broken reeds, and, bowed in grief, we hear remorseful sigh, and pardon ask, because we let you die.
Julian's enlistment had caused Gould to reassess and renounce his own involvement in the peace movement.
I will here affirm, as honestly as I have affirmed anything all my life, that I believe millions of our young citizens joined the army with a spirit as free from imperialism or militarism as his. One of his last wishes, expressed in a letter pencilled amid the filth and misery of the field of war, was that he might see the glories of Lincoln Cathedral once again. Among my circle of acquaintance, the non-resistance minds and conscientious objector types were distinctly numerous. My judgment, both retrospectively and immediate, named them as less manly and less worthy.
By 1920, Gould's convictions and derisory attitude to the peace movement and conscientious objectors in particular saw him at utter odds with the society. While Gould had been denouncing pacifism in the years since his son's death, the society and Jimson had been vigorously campaigning for the re-enfranchisement of those objectors and deserters such as Charlie Hassell, Edgar Eagle and Jack Abbott. On February 12, 1920, Gould, the Society's former secretary, would be opposed by the Society to take the platform or speak at the hall.
The Society held a list of approved lecturers or something of that kind, and he was due to come to the anniversary meeting, which was a big event every year, to speak, and there was a group of members who objected, didn't want him here, on the grounds that he had been unsympathetic to conscientious objectors, and it was decided to take Gould off their list. No, it wouldn't. I don't think it's appropriate for a free thought society, especially given the amount of work he'd done for it. But on the other hand, there were conscientious objectors in the society who had suffered. But at the time, I might have taken a more emotional view. At the time, I might have been voting with the people who wanted him away.
The extreme emotions and opinions provoked by the Great War challenged the very core values of free thought rationalism. This question of what constitutes free speech and what sort of people and ideologies had the right to public platform would only take on a greater and graver significance for the society as the 20th century marched forward. On the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, a now much changed society took the decision that they would continue their Sunday lectures despite the war, though things would not continue quite as they had before.
it struggled a bit during the war years because obviously so many of its members were away and were fighting. The society was probably quite important to the women who met here weekly. Obviously, lots of the activities, the social activities, came to an end or were dying because there just weren't the people here, and you know, there wasn't the money, and just all the practical difficulties of wartime.
We had a job to pay our way. We had to make a very big effort to write to everyone, as indeed we've just done again. Thousands of pounds we had to pay in rates, and where all religious organisations are rate-free.
Under new air raid precaution powers, the council were to take over both the basement and front room of the hall with immediate effect. The front room was from now to be used as a warden post, while the basement of the hall would be used as a critical air raid shelter for the city.
The authorities made us make a lot of changes, and we had the basement, as you know, turned into a shelter, and we had hundreds of people down there every night. On the right-hand side of the hall down there was a cupboard that we kept music and things like that in, and that was taken out, and I never travelled the tunnel myself, but it was tunnels into the Black Lion pub next door as a getaway.
For safety, obviously, if we got a bomb or we could go through there and vice versa. It's not really visible because they've bricked it up obviously now and put electrical boxes over the wall. But if you go down into the basement, you can see about where it was straight through, which was quite fascinating to me anyway.
On the night of November 19th, 1940, the bombs fell on Leicester.
There was bombing here and quite close to the Secular Hall. I mean, the International Hotel is really a bomb site. I think that was where the, was it Freeman Hardy and Willis building was that was bombed? I mean, there was a string of bombs that went to, presumably aimed at the railway station, but if you walk through Highfields and see where all the different little garages are in Saxby Street, Conduit Street, Highfield Street, it's where a string of bombs fell, and I mean, they killed quite a few people, missing the synagogue very narrowly.
As the sirens sounded, civilians flooded into the basement of the hall. 150 bombs and parachute mines were dropped on the city in a raid that lasted over 8 hours.
The night Leicester was bombed, my parents made, I think, 100 and something cups of tea, and everyone flocked in and came every night, as regular as clockwork. Yeah, that was when Freeman, Hardy and Willis were bombed. Yeah.
There are committee meeting minutes or short committee meeting minutes saying, minutes of committee meeting held in the basement of the Secular Hall during an air raid. So I think it probably didn't start in the basement. It probably started up here and moved down to the basement for the air raid.
To go under air raid shelters, and say we didn't because we weren't in the town, to have to run along streets and that amongst the bombing and get into air raid shelters and stay, and then climb out in the morning and see the horrific debris and your house gone. Must have been, well, you can only imagine.
By morning, the full devastation of the night raid had become clear. 11 factories and warehouses had been laid to waste, and 550 houses destroyed. Bert Orton's old workplace at Freeman, Hardy and Willis on Rutland Street would be left badly damaged, along with 72 other factories and 4,200 houses. By the night's end, 203 civilians had been left injured, and 102 people lay dead. Throughout the war, the Secular Hall remained one of the few places still open on a Sunday. Drinking, dancing and music continued as major attractions of the Society's socials, and despite the Hall's financial troubles, fundraising for causes such as aid to Russia were continued, as were charitable policies of the First World War for returning and wounded soldiers. Both British and US troops were made welcome at the Hall and were free to help themselves to the Hall's facilities and entertainments. However, this open-door policy, and particularly the invitation of American black GIs, would provoke some disapproval in the city.
Well, if you think about the American forces, they were segregated. And American forces, the black forces, were not allowed to go to the same dances as the white American forces, even though they might be dancing with the same group of English women. And I think there was some protest which went from the Secular Society about this. I hope there was anyway.
In November 1943, the Hall and Humberston Gate would be officially declared out of bounds by the Auxiliary Territorial Service. The minutes report that this was
due to coloured American troops at the dances and the number of licensed houses close by.
The ATS also assured that
this was not to cast any reflection on the Secular Society or the Hall.
The Hall's reputation for dissidence would further not have been helped by its continued affiliations with communists and conscientious objectors.
Well, there were, a lot of people got signed up, drafted into the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, whatever, and quite a lot of people, I think, signed up simply because it was a national war. Quite a few people, there were quite a lot of conscientious objectors, but there were some who genuinely believed that they were fighting a war against fascism.
Many members of the Society would again heed the call-up in the war against Nazism, Jack and Grace Abbott's boy Godfrey among them, though, like his father, he too was reported missing on active service along with fellow Society member Jim Cartwright Jr. The two were feared dead, yet both would survive the war. Charlie Hassell, still within the age for conscription, would again refuse the call-up and face a tribunal. However, by the Second World War, prison time was no longer the punishment for conscientious objectors. Instead, they would be put to service in the most dangerous home front occupations.
There were much better ways of dealing with conscientious objectors by the authorities in the Second World War. I mean, for instance, quite a few conscientious objectors became involved with removal of unexploded bombs, for instance, and were in the Pioneer Corps doing things like that. And they weren't ostracised in quite the same way as they were in the First World War.
Louis Croxtall's husband and Leicester Secular Society member Leslie Croxtall similarly made his stand against the war.
How I met him? Yes. Dancing in the basement at the Hall, and he said he got to be in by midnight, and so I saw him to the door and he said, "Can I see you tomorrow?" I said yes, and that was the beginning. Yeah, he had a good education, yes, and very anxious to learn any and everything, and he liked being with people who knew more than he did. Yes, yes. He was a fine fella, really. Yes, yeah.
Very happy, sunny, optimistic. Always made me walk on the sunny side of the street. Always got to, even if we weren't going that way, got to walk on the sunny side. Whatever he did, he threw himself into wholeheartedly. When he was 17, he had this peace movement, and he belonged to it. He tried to get going world peace. His idea was, if all the governments got together and shared things and shared speech, there needn't be wars.
As he said, we weren't fighting for what they were supposed to be fighting for. We were fighting for power and minerals and oil and those things. It wasn't, he didn't lack courage, because I've seen him actually fight, physically fight, but he wouldn't kill, he wouldn't handle arms. He went before a tribunal. I remember that day very well, yes. And my father went to speak for him if necessary, yes. He signed the Atlantic Charter, yes. So he was drafted into civil defence, yes.
He just did, he drove an ambulance, I think, the civil defence he was in. Then you didn't have to go to prison if you would agree to do the saving part of it.
You know, and a lot of the conscientious objectors in the Second World War also did heroic things, particularly in bomb disposal, which was you need to be a particular brand of heroism to get involved with that.
Well, they gave him all these tins that were damaged and were likely to explode, and he had to open them and get out of the way as they were, yeah. And then he had to lead some sort of convoy somewhere down to Bristol in a thick fog, yeah.
All right.
And he got to walk, yeah. Things like that they gave him to do, yeah. Right. But it didn't deter him, not a little bit.
My mother said a fairer man she never met, and she said he was such a fair, level-headed man and very brave. His beliefs were, well, unbelievably strong.
We were the first people to entertain German prisoners of war, and I was quite happy to do that, and so was my husband. And we used to go and fetch them from Scraptoft camp and bring them and share our rations with them, yes, in true socialist style, yeah. We had the Dr. Zeiss, yes. We had the Yaisky, the Padre, and Hines the dentist, yes, so several more, yes. And none of them had ever belonged to the Nazi Party. Prisoners were happy to be in a family, like. And the doctor had a little doll's house made for us, for Diane, yes. And all the prisoners made tiny little pieces of furniture to go in this doll's house. And Diane still got some, yes, which she treasures, yes. Little upholstered armchairs, and yeah, yeah. So that's a nice memory, yeah.
They came Sundays for the day, and my father fetched them and took them back, and he loved talking to them because obviously all Germans aren't the enemy, are they? And they wrote every Christmas to my mother until very recently, which maybe they've died now, but every year we got ones from Heinz and one from Hans, Christmas card with a little letter inside of appreciation of them. Yeah, but that's what my father hated, you know, to be shooting at a man there's no reason, you don't know him, you don't know what he's done. I mean, you just wouldn't have that at all. No, you wouldn't.
Well, you might think that they objected, but as I say, I was so innocent that it never occurred to me that people might object. So I was quite innocent, yes, yes. And the only person that did was the butcher in Thurmaston, who said that old bugger, yes. That's the only thing I ever heard against him, yeah.
The social stigma for being a conscientious objector may not have had a particularly public backlash, but it would continue to inspire long-term prejudices that still pervade to this day.
As a conscientious objector during the war, I know it's marred his life with jobs, because as soon as people found out he didn't get the job, he used to be very hurt if he didn't get jobs he really wanted because of it. I think it was unfair, but that's people, isn't it? And as far on as me meeting my husband, as soon as his father found out that my father he wouldn't speak to me and he didn't come to the wedding. My fault, but I'm afraid I wouldn't back down from that, because I was very proud of him to have stuck to his principles. He was a great man of principles. So it used to make me feel very angry and very protective of my father because I knew he was anything but a coward. I've got a photo of him just inside as you walk out my kitchen, and he's smiling as I always remember him to be smiling, and I'm very proud of him. I did manage to tell him I was proud of him before he died, and I just wish I'd managed to tell him how much it affected my life.
The moral question of war, and particularly with regards to fascism, is one that continues to confound and divide. Some secularists, such as Leslie Croxtall, renounced all war as murder for the interest of capitalism, dividing and oppressing the workers of the world. Yet for others, such as Roy Watts, the fascist ideology presented a very singular threat to that same international brotherhood and had to be fought to be overcome. Both these convictions held a belief in the true fraternity of man, and both would demand immeasurable courage to enact.
Advent of sort of fascism, both earlier in Italy and then in Germany, that put a different complexion on the fact. And you did have the formation of the Leicester Black Shirts in 1934, who, you know, held meetings in the marketplace and were, you know, could be seen on the streets, and they wrote slogans on the roadway. They were pretty active, and of course, obviously, a group of anti-fascists who tried to stop them from meeting in the marketplace. And there were quite some significant sort of battles that went on, eventually leading to the police banning the black shirts from meeting in the marketplace, and they then met in Humberston Gate. So you've got that sort of domestic issue. Then, of course, the whole things about world peace, and you know, then of course came Spain. And then you've got people volunteering to go and fight with the Republicans in Spain. And of course you've got the people that went from Leicester and didn't come back.
3 years before the breakout of the Second World War, the fascist question in Spain had been an issue of immense interest to Leicester Secular Society, and in particular to one 22-year-old Roy Watts. Roy had been a vehement anti-fascist activist since his early days in Portsmouth. As a member of Portsmouth Trades Council and the Independent Labour Party Guild of Youth, he was reported to have attempted to sabotage a meeting of Mosley's Black Shirts at a local hall, barracking Mosley on the stage. Unsurprisingly, Roy was next seen swiftly turfed down the steps of the hall, his coat torn from hem to collar. In Leicester, Roy started work in the furniture department of the Co-op. He was a member of the Communist Party and the Clarion Socialist Cycling Club that would regularly use the hall. Roy became a frequent face at the hall's socials and became a popular figure among the society.
I loved Roy. He used to come, he worked at the Co-op furnishing. He used to come in every night, and because it's when I lived there, and we used to play table tennis, yes. And also, he and I used to start the dancing upstairs. I loved Roy, yes. He was. I wasn't in love with him. I've got a boyfriend of my own, but he was. I loved him anyway.
I mean, I suspect, you know, Roy Watts first and foremost was originally a member of the Independent Labour Party Guild of Youth, and then he joined the Communist Party along with Frank Sykes, and it was probably through the Communist Party that they went to Spain. I mean, I suspect they attended meetings in the Secular Society, but I don't think they were hugely active within the society as such. So I think they met in the hall.
Franco's fascist offensive on the Spanish Republic was an urgent call to arms for Roy, who had always so loathed the values of fascism and its terrifying advent across Europe. With two other Leicester lads, Jack Watts and Fred Sykes, Roy joined the International Brigade to show solidarity with the Spanish Republic.
It wasn't by any means a left-wing government, but it was a democratically elected government, and that was being overthrown by foreign intervention. And our government looked the other way whilst it was happening, and in fact enabled it to happen by having really a blockade of Spanish ports to stop arms coming in to aid the legitimate government. Yeah, clearly, you know, with the First World War, you know, not so long ago, people knew what it was like to fight in a war and probably knew the risks involved. And clearly, there are very significant risks, not just in trying to get into Spain, but in fighting in a, you know, an army which was not very well prepared and very well organised against, you know, vastly superior forces. So I think would have been quite heroic in my view to go and undertake that.
Mostly it was done through the Communist Party. It formed together into a group of between 6 to 15 and they'd be taken over to Paris as tourists, put up in Paris for a couple of nights, and then early on they could just catch the train straight into Spain, but later when the French tried to stop them they had to walk over the Pyrenees, which they did. They had guides and they had to go over in the dark at night and dodge the guards and get over into Spain that way.
In a letter to the National Clarion Cycling Club from the Spanish front, Roy passionately outlined the moral case for the fight against fascism.
I am happy and proud to place my services with the workers of Spain in their heroic fight against the bestialities of fascism. We have nothing in common with the outlook of the fascists who glorify death as their ideal. We love life, but because we love it, we do not begrudge giving it in order to save humanity from the enemies of life. Many of our best comrades have already fallen, and we do not hide the bitter pain of their loss, but their deaths call not for mourning, but for action.
Roy himself fought fiercely. He had been held prisoner once and been hospitalised 3 times by a shrapnel wound by the time this letter to his old roommate, R.V. Walton, was received in 1938.
I have served and been into action with the artillery, infantry and transmission units. I have been in most of the territory in Loyalist hands and was taken prisoner once. Apart from a slight touch of fever and a small piece of shrapnel which took me to hospital 3 times, I have so far come through it all comparatively unscratched. I have learnt to love this country. The beauty of it is breathtaking. It is a sickening experience to pass through these lovely Spanish towns after the fascist shellings and bombings. I know that such an experience would soon stimulate those at home to oust those responsible for aiding aggression and war. Since our advances, the fascist fury seems to know no bounds. War being what it is, one cannot make any forecast with certainty, but I expect and hope to be back in England by Christmas.
Roy died at the Battle of Ebro, 1938. He was 24. Louis Croxtall recalls the night news of Roy's death reached the hall.
I understand that he was fitting up a hut with electricity when he met his end. Yeah. Very sad, yeah. I remember the night very well. We were all at the hall, yes. We got a meeting in the lecture room and we were in our living room and we heard howls and screams and a girl came in and she just heard that Roy Watts had been killed, yes. And she apparently was his girlfriend, yes. And I know in the end my mother had to fetch her in because she was disturbing all the meeting, yes. Very sad, yeah. I missed him, yes, yeah. I think we would.
Some 50 years after their deaths, a campaign was launched to erect a monument in their memory at Leicester's Peace Walk. With the help of the Society and its members, the memorial stone would be unveiled in 1989. Campaigner and later president of the Secular Society, Lynn Hurst, recalls the campaign.
We learnt about the 3 and decided to put something up. We hadn't got a clue what we thought about making something and screwing it to the wall, a building in High Street that we were using at the time, you see. And when it was like the social thing, it just grew. It just grew and grew really into a proper monument, a proper event, and then we had to raise money then to pay for it. So it just grew. It didn't take as long though. The monument itself cost £750. We soon raised that, and we got a plot in Peace Walk from the council. I just took that and pared the words down as shortly as possible to describe what it was about. And then at the bottom, no passaran, they shall not pass.
The tumult of the early 20th century would leave its mark on the Secular Hall and the Society. From those who fought for what they believed, to those who defied the call-up and opposed the war. Divisive opinion, passionate action, and alternative politics have always been at home in the hall.
Hall continues as a facility for any group that wants to meet in Leicester. Yeah, so it enables different causes to exist, and you know that's what it's done. It's enabled that sort of democratic process of different pressure groups and different people to come together and talk about their concerns, whatever they may be.
I was part of a group called Troops Out, getting the British troops out of Northern Ireland, and we had trouble having places to meet, actually. So the Secular Society was a very important venue for unpopular ideas which could be discussed openly. It's very important.
The fact that it's supplied an open platform for free speech in Leicester for over 130 years, I think is a fitting tribute that they can be proud of.
Those early wars of the 20th century would create questions and draw the dividing lines that still define the society to this day. However, one idea has always united the society, even in the face of war. Whether freedom fighter or pacifist, idealist or pragmatist, socialist, liberal, Christian or atheist, peace and brotherhood will only be found in the rational pursuit of justice, liberty and truth.
I think it's a society that you would be very proud to belong to. Yeah, well, I think so anyway. Yeah.